there, everyone! Welcome to my channel Creepy Narratives. Today, I'm thrilled to share more spine-chilling stories that have actually happened to me and others who have experienced these so-called creepy scenarios. These incidents were so eerie, creepy and strange that they had us questioning the very reality that we knew. So, sit back, relax and prepare to be captivated by the enigma of these creepy narratives. Welcome to my nightmare. I think that you're going to like it. Enjoy. Let's start with story number 1. Story number 1. Midnight intrusion in the wilderness. Let me take you back to a chilling night from a few years ago when I was a 31-year-old trucker heading from Tucson, Arizona, to Salt Lake City, Utah. My journey took an unexpected twist when I found myself rerouted through the desolate mountains of lower Utah due to the main highway being closed off for construction. As darkness settled in, exhaustion began to gnaw at my senses, so I decided to pull over onto the shoulder and catch some much-needed rest in my trusty old truck's bunk. Now, let me set the stage for you. This was the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town a whopping 40 miles away. The absence of any nearby civilization enveloped me in an inky blackness that seemed impenetrable. I turned off my truck's lights, closed my eyes, and tried to drift into slumber. But around 4 a.m., my peace was shattered by an unsettling noise. I was wide awake in an instant, my senses alert, and I could hear something messing around with my truck's exterior. It sounded like it was toying with the air and power cables, mere inches from where my head was in the cab. Unease settled in like a shroud as I sensed something climbing onto the rear landing of my truck. The whole rig shook under the weight, and I estimated it to be a couple of 100 pounds, at least. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was a mountain lion or perhaps a bear prowling outside. With every nerve on high alert, I decided I needed to scare away whatever it was out there. I slammed my hand into the cab wall with all the force I could muster, creating a thunderous noise that reverberated through the night. It was loud enough to wake the dead. Or, in this case, something much more unexpected. As the echoes of my pounding hand filled the air, a blood-curdling scream pierced through the darkness, and it wasn't mine. I heard the sound of someone screaming in sheer terror, and it was swiftly followed by a chorus of about 15 other voices, all around my truck. It was absolute chaos. My heart pounded in my chest as I climbed up to the front of my truck, fumbling for the light switches. With a flick, I bathed the area in the harsh glow of my headlights, revealing a scene that I could have never anticipated. There, illuminated before me, was a squad of Army reserves, clad in their combat gear, doing midnight rock march and capture drills. As it turned out, their mission involved finding and securing an abandoned truck, which just happened to be 3 miles back down the road. They hadn't expected me to be sleeping there, and they mistakenly thought I was part of their drill, blending seamlessly into the wilderness. Being ex-military myself, I quickly explained that I was not part of their test, but merely a trucker who had ended up there by coincidence. Laughter and relief filled the air as we all realized the absurdity of the situation. They radioed their commanding officer, explaining the mix-up, and ensured that no other squads would disturb my rest that night. Let's go to story number 2. Story number 2. Radio silence enigma. I may not be a trucker, but I've spent my fair share of time as a commercial delivery driver in a rural area in the heart of the American Midwest. One peculiar day, as I was leaving our home store to embark on my daily route, something bizarre happened with the radio. It was the kind of strange occurrence that makes you question reality. As I hopped into my delivery vehicle, ready to tackle the day's tasks, I casually turned on the radio, expecting my usual dose of tunes and talk shows. However, to my bewilderment, the radio emitted only a disconcerting silence. No matter how hard I tried to switch between stations, there was no sound, just an eerie void. At that moment, I assumed it was a mere glitch, perhaps a technical malfunction. I even considered that maybe the local radio station had gone off the air. As I continued with my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. I spoke with my coworkers, who were equally baffled by the radio's unexplained silence, but we decided to carry on with our tasks, hoping it would resolve itself. Strangely, this mysterious radio blackout extended beyond the confines of my delivery vehicle. I called my fiancée and my best friend, who were both located on the opposite side of the country in areas far from rural areas, and they reported the same eerie silence on their radios. Even my mother, in yet another distant location, confirmed that her radio was also devoid of sound. Everyone I contacted was experiencing this inexplicable phenomenon. As the day wore on, I couldn't help but feel like something peculiar was unfolding. It was as if a heavy shroud of silence had descended upon us all, leaving us in a perplexing void of auditory nothingness. In an attempt to break this eerie silence, I left the radio on in the car, even though it emitted nothing but static. Then, out of nowhere, something strange happened. Amidst the static, I began to hear faint voices. These voices were unlike any language I'd ever heard before, and it was impossible for me to discern their meaning. The words seemed to be uttered by a female computerized voice, and their cadence was both eerie and mesmerizing. I wasn't alone in experiencing this oddity. My coworkers at the store also reported hearing these voices emanating from their radios, confirming that I wasn't losing my mind. Yet, as the hours passed, the static returned, and the voices faded back into obscurity. What truly bewildered me about this strange occurrence was the lack of media attention. There was no mention of the hours-long radio blackout, and no radio station or news outlet acknowledged that anything unusual had transpired. It was as if the world had collectively forgotten this inexplicable event, leaving me with an unsettling sense of unanswered questions and the disconcerting feeling that I had witnessed something beyond explanation. Are you ready for story number 3? Story number 3. The Basement's Dark Secret. In my early 20s, I embarked on a unique job as a meter reader in the charming town of Iowa City, Iowa. My responsibilities included recording the electricity, gas, and water usage of residents each month. However, to ensure accurate readings, I often found myself entering homes, whether the occupants were present or not. It was a task that never ceased to make me feel like an intruder, trespassing into the private lives of others. The exterior of a home merely reflected the image its inhabitants projected to the world. The real secrets, the raw and unfiltered truth, often lay hidden within the home itself. The basement, I discovered, was the epicenter of these concealed truths, a place where the facades crumbled, and reality was laid bare. Entering a home when the owner wasn't present was always an uneasy endeavor, no matter how loudly I knocked. It was as if I was navigating a delicate balance between fulfilling my job duties and respecting the privacy of others. The interior of a home was an intimate space, and the basement, with its secrets shrouded in darkness, was where the unvarnished reality of residents often revealed itself. Throughout my time as a meter reader, I encountered basements that seemed like scenes from surreal nightmares. There were walls adorned with roaches that resembled static-filled TV screens, cobwebs so thick and dusty that they could be mistaken for a cotton candy explosion at a spider carnival, and rats, snakes, and various other unsavory creatures lurking in the shadows. Some basements held evidence of neglect, feces, weapons, neglected children, and abused pets. Others were temporary shelters for homeless squatters, and some were filled with massive hordes of items that defied explanation. I stumbled upon a makeshift meth lab, a coffin inexplicably tucked away, and a trove of bizarre sexual paraphernalia that left me bewildered. Yet, amidst all these oddities, there was one basement that defied any rational explanation and haunted my thoughts long after I had left its dark confines. It was an unassuming old apartment house, much like the others on the block, but what lay beneath its surface was a mystery that left me both intrigued and unnerved. Upon entering the basement, I was immediately engulfed in a profound darkness. My fingers brushed against the wall as I searched for a light switch, but to no avail. I had no flashlight with me, as my typical route involved long hours of walking, and I preferred to carry as little as possible. Undeterred by the darkness, I inched my way through the basement, moving slowly and cautiously. My handheld screen, which I often used as a source of light, illuminated only a small area in front of me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance in the inky blackness. As I explored further, I stumbled upon 2 doors, each leading to a small room. I chose the one on the right, instinctively drawn to it. In the corner of that room, I found the meters I needed to read. However, as I focused on my task, a faint, pitiful noise began to emanate from the other room, a room I hadn't entered. The sound grew louder with each passing moment, and I strained to identify its source. It was a whimpering, a sound of distress, and it was unmistakably coming from the room next door. My heart sank as I approached the door, but it was locked. On the other side, the whimpering grew more frantic, and I could hear the scratching of paws against the wooden door. It was a dog, and it sounded weak and desperate, trapped in a place it couldn't escape. I did what any humane person would do. I reported the situation to my office, hoping that someone would come to rescue the distressed animal. But the image of that locked door and the pitiful cries of the dog stayed with me over the next month, haunting my thoughts and making me wonder about the fate of that poor creature. A month later, it was time for me to return to that basement, the one with the locked door and the trapped dog. I knew where the meters were located, and I braced myself for the possibility of hearing that distressed whimper once more. As I entered the basement, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, as if I were revisiting a place I shouldn't have. I made my way to the room on the right, where the meters were situated, all the while keeping my ears tuned to any sounds emanating from the adjacent room. This time, there was nothing, no sign of the distressed dog, no whimpering, and no scratching at the door. The room was eerily quiet. My curiosity got the best of me as I stood outside the locked door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I jiggled it ever so slightly, and that's when everything changed. From the other side of the door, a cacophony of sound erupted, screams that pierced the very core of my being. These were no ordinary screams, they were blood-curdling, inhuman, and agonized. The kind of screams that sent shivers down your spine and chilled you to your very soul. The screams were followed by guttural moans, like something out of a nightmare, and then transformed into a haunting, mournful crying that filled the room. It was as if the very walls of the basement were weeping. Terrified and overwhelmed, I stumbled backward, away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had heard many unsettling things in the basements I'd visited during my time as a meter reader, but this was beyond anything I could comprehend. The basement held a dark secret, one that defied all logic and explanation, and it was a secret that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Let's continue with story number 4. Story number 4. The screams in the darkness. The room was enveloped in darkness, save for the faint glow from the streetlight outside casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance, as the chilling screams pierced the silence. Panic surged through me, my heart racing, and I couldn't help but shout, "Hello? Who's in there?" There was no response, only more screams, agonized and gut-wrenching. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" I pleaded, my voice trembling. Still, there was no response, only the relentless screams that seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder and more intense. I knew I had to leave that room. Fear gnawed at me, and I fumbled my way through the darkened space toward the exit, my hands shaking with every step. As I reached the top of the stairs, I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my mind around what I had just experienced. I waited for the screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left that room, the screams were still as loud and demented as when they had first begun. I felt relieved to escape, but that relief quickly turned to dread as I realized I would have to return the next month to read the meters. I reported what I had heard, but nothing came of it. As the day of my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside me. What kind of lunatic sat alone in total darkness and silence, screaming like a man possessed? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell lay beyond that door. By the time I returned, I had built him up in my mind so much that anyone other than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him that next month, or even the several months that followed. I had nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Laura, and after the show, I gave her a ride home. She had recently moved to a new place, and as she directed me to her house, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the same house with the mysterious room in the basement. This sounds weird, but have you noticed anything odd about the basement? I began to ask, but before I could finish my sentence, she blurted out, "A crazy guy lives down there." Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me about the strange experiences she had in her new home. She often heard the man yelling late at night, but that wasn't all. She had actually encountered him one day while walking to her car. He stood there, perfectly still, with an eerie expressionless face, but he did something that sent chills down her spine. He stuck out his tongue and quickly sucked it back into his mouth before returning to his statue-like stance. Thoroughly creeped out, she had driven away and hadn't interacted with him since. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met the man in the basement. I entered the back door, just as I had done so many months before, but this time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement, and I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog I had heard during my first visit. But there was more. I could see a pair of bare feet behind the dog, and I knew it was him. I should have left right then, but my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, "Meter reader," and started to make my descent. As I read the meters, he paced back and forth, wringing his hands and cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became, grimacing and blurting out strange sounds. When I finally made my way to the exit, his screams erupted once more, those same unforgettable screams that had haunted my nightmares. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. Months passed, and I had almost forgotten about the man in the basement. That is until one day when my friend Laura shared a disturbing piece of news. She had seen police officers placing the man from the basement in the back seat of a squad car. It turned out he had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him, but the mystery of what drove him to those horrifying screams still lingers in my mind. Are you ready for story number 5? Story number 5. The Hotel Intrusion. It was April of 2008, and I was 20 years old, living in Denver for a year-long work contract with a non-profit in Boulder. To celebrate my upcoming 21st birthday, my girlfriend, now my wife, and my best friend Tim decided to visit me. I had booked a hotel room in downtown Denver for the weekend so we could drink and enjoy the occasion. The hotel was big, luxurious, and located in a safe central area of the city. Little did we know that it was the same hotel where politicians would later stay during the 2008 DNC convention in Denver. Our day had been fantastic, filled with drinks and laughter as we explored the city. By 1 a.m., we returned to the hotel, and the room was typical, a room with 2 queen beds. Bed number 1 was close to a big window that offered a view of the city, while bed number 2 was pushed against the wall with a door that led to the bathroom. You couldn't see the bathroom door unless you were at the foot of bed number 1. We continued to chat and enjoy our time in the room until around 4 a.m. My wife was relaxing at the head of bed number 2, flipping through the TV channels. Tim and I were seated at the foot of bed number 1, staring out the window as we talked. That's when I heard it, a slight movement and the sound of a door opening behind us. Without turning around, I assumed it was my wife getting up to use the bathroom. A few minutes passed, and I thought I heard the movement again, so I finally turned around to look. To my surprise, my wife was still lounging in bed number 2, just as she had been all along. I asked her, "Did you get up a few minutes ago and use the bathroom?" "No," she replied, looking puzzled. I was confused, but I continued, "I thought I heard a door." "Yeah, I thought I heard that too," Tim chimed in, turning away from the window. That's when a chilling realization settled in. There was someone else in our room, and they were moving around. My heart started to race, and I softly told my wife and Tim, "I think there's someone in our room." We all grew quiet, straining our ears to listen. The room was pitch black, and we couldn't see anything. Fear gripped us as we contemplated what to do next.
It's time for story number 6.
Story number 6. The Mysterious Intruder. It was a Friday night, and I found myself home alone as my friends and roommates had all headed out of town for the weekend. My dad worked night shifts, and my younger sister was away, so the house was quiet and peaceful. Little did I know that this night would turn into a terrifying ordeal I would never forget. I settled into the evening, each room in our suburban house echoing with solitude. I was engrossed in my own activities, completely unaware of the unsettling events that were about to unfold. As the night grew darker, I began to hear peculiar noises coming from outside my window. Our quiet suburban neighborhood made any unusual sound stand out like a sore thumb, and these noises were no exception. At first, I dismissed them as the wind rustling the trees or perhaps a stray animal. But as the noises persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, I couldn't help but be drawn to them. Curiosity soon got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. With cautious steps, I tiptoed to my bedroom window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. What I saw in the dim moonlight sent shivers down my spine. There, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, stood a man dressed entirely in black. His black baseball cap was pulled low over his eyes, effectively concealing his face. What made it even more unnerving was how he was positioned. He was pressed into the 90-degree corner where the room door met the wall, like a shadowy figure waiting in the darkness. The moment our eyes met, an inexplicable silence descended upon the room. Panic gripped me like a vice, and my heart pounded violently in my chest. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. We both knew. We knew we weren't alone, and more chillingly, we knew that he knew we had spotted him. I felt trapped, unable to move or even to speak. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but none seemed to offer any solace or explanation for this eerie intruder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my friend Tim, who had been in the room adjacent to mine, mustered the courage to speak, his voice trembling with fear. "Is there something we can help you out with?" Another excruciatingly long silence followed, and the intruder seemed to slouch further into the dim light before making eerie eye contact with Tim and me. The tension in the room was unbearable as we locked eyes with this mysterious and menacing figure. Eventually, the intruder broke the silence, his voice low and unsettling as he asked, "Is this room 1709? "No, man, it's not," Tim replied, his voice wavering, his hand nervously stroking his beard. The intruder continued to gaze at us, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head in disbelief. Then, with an unsettling and almost manic laugh, he turned and left the room, disappearing into the shadows. After he was gone, we erupted into a frenzied exchange of expletives, pacing around the room, trying to make sense of this bizarre and terrifying encounter. My trembling hands dialed the front desk to report the incident, and we received a perplexing explanation that the intruder was simply a drunk who had stumbled into the wrong room and was redirected to the correct one. Later, Tim called the front desk for more information, and they told him a different story, claiming that the intruder was not a registered guest and had been taken into police custody. My wife even called the front desk, and they provided yet another contradictory account, stating that they had no knowledge of the intruder and that there wasn't even a room 1709 in the hotel. To this day, the incident remains a perplexing and chilling mystery, leaving us with unanswered questions and an enduring sense of unease. It was a harrowing experience that taught me never to underestimate the importance of using the latch in hotel rooms, and it remains a story that sends shivers down my spine whenever I recount it.
Let's go on to story number 7.
Story number 7. The Blind Patient's Haunting Call. Working the night shift at a maximum security psychiatric hospital came with its own set of challenges and eerie encounters. The hospital itself had a haunting history, having been built in the 1950s as an asylum. Its cold, concrete walls and echoing sounds created an atmosphere of constant unease, especially when you were alone. one particularly unsettling patient stood out in my memory. He had been with us for quite some time and was blind. However, his blindness wasn't a result of a natural condition but rather a tragic consequence of his own actions. Years ago, he had gouged out his own eyes, driven to the brink of madness by haunting visions that tormented him relentlessly. Despite his blindness, the disturbing part was that it hadn't provided him with relief from his hallucinations. Instead, he continued to suffer, but now all he could see were those tormenting visions that had driven him to his extreme act. Every night, as I made my rounds through the dimly lit and eerily quiet corridors, I passed by his room. And there he stood, facing the wall, his back to the door. He remained completely motionless, unresponsive to the world around him. It was a haunting sight, but not entirely unusual in a psychiatric hospital, where many patients exhibited catatonic behavior. One particular night, as I walked past his room, keeping my distance as I always did, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. His voice, barely a whisper, called out my name. "Sarah, is that you?" The words hung in the air, and I froze in place. I couldn't fathom how he knew my name, let alone that it was me standing there in the hallway. This was a patient who had gouged out his own eyes, rendering himself blind. He shouldn't have been able to perceive my presence or even recognize me. Paralyzed by fear, I didn't respond. I simply continued walking down the dimly lit corridor, haunted by the sensation that something otherworldly had taken place. That night, the hospital's cold, echoing halls felt more sinister than ever, and the memory of his haunting call continues to send shivers down my spine.